Liberal cabinet ministers are gathered here in Montreal to strategize before returning to Parliament next week. They say they're focused on some key issues affecting Canadians like housing and affordability, but the leader of the opposition says the Liberals are in a different kind of retreat.
He's retreating on everything he has done over the last 8 years, right? After 8 years of Trudeau, life costs more, work doesn't pay, housing costs have doubled, crime, chaos, drugs, and disorder are common in our streets, and he divides to distract from all that he has broken. Justin Trudeau is not worth the cost.
Joining us now to discuss the focus of this retreat is Dominic LeBlanc, Minister of Public Safety and Intergovernmental Affairs. Minister, good to see you again.
Hi, good evening, David.
Obviously, Pierre Poilievre is not impressed with the agenda you've set out here.
Surprising, isn't it?
Well, I'm as shocked as you are. You come here at an interesting time. We have seen the new polling data, once again, a persistent double-digit lead for the Conservatives over the Liberals. What's your assessment of why Canadians seem to be losing faith in your government?
Canadians have gone through a very difficult period in the last number of years. I mean, going back to COVID, after COVID, interest rates went up, inflation was an issue, global supply chains. It's been tough on millions and millions of Canadians. So they're understandably concerned and worried, largely about economic issues. They're concerned about issues like auto theft. They're concerned about issues around the cost of housing. They want a government that's focused on those issues. They want a government that's taking concrete steps to do things that will improve their situation quickly. That's what we're discussing here in these meetings in Montreal, David. Standing in front of a sign and insulting people or pointing the finger at others doesn't actually solve the circumstance of these millions of Canadians who have understandable concerns. So we're doing the difficult but important work of trying to alleviate the affordability pressure, trying to deal with the housing pressures, and we'll continue to do that.
Increasingly, though, I mean, you see it in this data, and I'm sure you hear it, when you travel around the country, that people are skeptical, if not completely doubtful, that the Liberals at this stage in the life cycle are the right party to solve a lot of these problems that you've outlined. How do you counter that?
Well, first of all, by not getting distracted from the work we need to do. You've been around politics a long time, David. You see these stories that become sort of common acceptance that this or that particular political party's in trouble, and then circumstances evolve, the situation changes, people's perceptions come and go. Tom Mulcair had a transition team in 2015 meeting to plan his takeover of the government, and he lost the election and then was kicked out of the NDP leadership some months later. So I think it's important for us not to be distracted from the work that Canadians elected us to do. In the next election, Canadians will have an opportunity to evaluate the work of the government and to choose between real alternatives. None of the above isn't on a ballot. When you go to vote, there's a series of real candidates, real choices, real political parties. We think that our government and our party is focused on and will bring significant improvements to the challenges that Canadians are facing, but there's a lot of work to do, and we haven't finished that work.
Do you have the time, though, to finish that work? Let's look at some of the key issues on housing. The Prime Minister on down have admitted you were slow to respond to this. We've seen a flurry of announcements since Sean Fraser has been the housing minister through the Housing Accelerator, but each of those announcements is the promise of housing, the potential of housing, rather than the reality of housing that's ready to go into the market right now. It's going to take some time.
And I don't share your pessimism. I mean, it's not...
I'm trying to be realistic.
But we heard from the mayor of Montreal, who met with us today, and talked concretely about affordable housing that's being built right now, foundations that were poured before the ground froze in this city, in Montreal. So there's a lot of work to do. I'm not pretending that the work is complete, but I wouldn't say that we haven't made an important dent in that work, but we need partners. We need provinces, we need municipalities, we need the private sector, we need not-for-profit groups. They're all engaged. I mean, this is a necessarily, the housing issue, that's the one we were talking about, necessarily requires different orders of government to work together. It requires private capital. So it's complicated, but it doesn't mean because it's not fixed tomorrow morning that we shouldn't continue to do the work. We've been doing a lot of work, but we need to do more work and quickly. And that's certainly my conversations as the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister with Premier Eby last week in British Columbia and Premier Canoe in Manitoba. I spoke to Premier Ford again on the weekend. They want to have a government that's an active partner in this area because we all recognize that it's very important to Canadians.
You had presentations today from economists on how to deal with the cost of living, how to deal with concerns about a possible recession in the Canadian economy. We spoke with Kevin Milligan and Armin Yalnizyan when they came out later, and they actually are arguing that what's required to some degree is big government investments, what they call the care economy, long-term care, child care, health care. Is that a direction you're willing to go in as a government? Because if you go back to the fall economic statement, it seemed like the messaging was more towards a little bit of restraint and returning to more traditional levels of government spending after the big spending days of the pandemic. Do you have the fiscal room and desire to go there?
So that is an interesting debate. I found it interesting to listen to those economists present to the cabinet earlier today. But on the issue, for example, of a care economy, the issue of something as important as childcare for families, that's a big affordability issue. Well, we've already built into our fiscal framework, into the government spending plans, a permanent childcare program nationally that lowers the cost to $10 a day. That is a very significant investment, but that's not new spending or additional spending. That's already built into the government spending plan, as is the hundreds of billions of dollars over a 10-year period that we're transferring to the provinces for healthcare. So my colleague, the health minister, talked to us about the agreements that he's close to finalizing with provinces. So to use two examples you raised, yes, we have to do a lot in those areas. That's what building an inclusive, prosperous economy requires. The good news is we've been doing that work also for a long period of time, and we've done a great deal in the last few years, but that spending is already accounted for. So I think we need to continue to make those thoughtful investments to ensure that our economy is inclusive and the affordability issues are dealt with head on. But as the Minister of Finance has said, there's not an unlimited amount of spending at a difficult time. Federal government took a huge amount of the burden of COVID. Some provinces, including my own in New Brunswick, are facing record surpluses. So there can also be in the fiscal federalism a bit of an adjustment in terms of the priorities that some of our provincial partners can also share with us as well.
A big priority for this year, you're going to be hearing from, well, Canada's ambassador to the United States on the upcoming U.S. election. Trump won was difficult for this government. NAFTA was put on the table. Tensions between the two countries were high because of the uncertain nature of him as a president. How worried are you as a government that he's going to win and come back?
Well, we're going to hear from Ambassador Hillman tomorrow. I had a chance to talk with her in the late fall when I was in Washington. Look, Canadians have been increasingly interested in U.S. politics. There are retired school teachers in my riding that spend more time watching CNN than CBC News World. I know it's shocking, David, for you, but it became in Mr. Trump's administration a reality where Canadians became interested in American presidential politics. So this is going to be a year where that takes up a lot of attention. Our focus is to be ready for whatever government the Americans elect. We don't choose the American government, they will. Any government of Canada needs to have a constructive, robust, trusting relationship with their American counterparts. The ambassador will talk to us about those opportunities. And in an election year, the sources of power in the American government, the American Congress are so diffuse that state governors, influential senators, and representatives in Congress can also have a lot of influence. And of course, it's a bipartisan context. So that's the work we're going to do, and we'll wait to see who Americans elect in November.
But as Trump seems to be surging, I mean, he is the runaway frontrunner for the Republican nomination. I think that's a pretty clear assessment of where things are, especially with Ron DeSantis dropping out. Your party has seemed to see an opportunity to exploit that in linking him to Pierre Poilievre, comparing him to the MAGA-style right-wing politics as a way of trying to discredit the conservative leader and perhaps help your political fortunes. I mean, are you hopeful of a Trump win because of how it might change, an external event that could change the political dynamic? Because some people in your party seem to think this is something they can exploit.
We're not going to spend a lot of time being hopeful on a particular outcome in an American election. Our job as a government is to work, as I said, with the government that Americans will choose. It's true that Mr. Poilievre practices a divisive form of politics with a considerable amount of misinformation. He's not afraid to assert a falsehood in a video or in a social media post. Canadians will judge that in an election, and Canadians have access to trusted sources of information that increasingly are calling out that kind of political tactic. Our job is to present to Canadians a progressive, inclusive government that has a plan to deal with the issues that are concerning them right now, and a plan to build an economy that works for them in the future. That's what we're focused on. I'm not worried about Mr. Poilievre's platform.
Mr. Poilievre and his supporters refer to your government as divisive. You know, going back to the convoy and vaccine mandates, you see these big issues that drove a big wedge into Canadian society. Do you think we're headed for perhaps one of the more polarized elections in the country's history? Because it certainly seems as if the political conversation in the country is moving to the extremes.
I certainly hope not. I think that Canadians benefit when there's a thoughtful exchange of ideas, including real points of divergence between political parties. That's healthy in a democracy. It's important that political parties can stick to the basic facts of a discussion. Mr. Poilievre has had some challenge doing that. It's not the case with other political parties, and it wasn't the case with some predecessor leaders of the Progressive Conservative Party. That used to exist years ago, you might remember that, or even the Conservative Party of Canada. So, but at the end of the day, our focus, David, when the election comes, will be to tell Canadians the work we've done to make their lives better and to offer them a hopeful, positive plan. And if others want to be divisive and focus on personal attacks, Canadians will judge. It didn't work in 2015 for Mr. Harper, and I don't know if it'll work in 2025 for Mr. Poilievre, but we have a lot of work to do between now and then.
Okay. Minister of Public Safety and Intergovernmental Affairs, Dominic LeBlanc, thanks for your time.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.